Standing on that stage in Stockholm, holding the most prestigious award in science, I couldn't help but think about Marcus. The same Marcus who, 3 years earlier, had looked me dead in the eye and said I'd never amount to anything without him. The same Marcus who was probably sitting in his apartment right now, watching me accept the Nobel Prize in Chemistry on live television. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The rain was hammering against the windows of our Chicago apartment when Marcus finally said what we'd both been avoiding for months. We'd been together since our sophomore year at Northwestern University, and now, 5 years later, I was staring at a man I barely recognized. "You're obsessed, Elena," he said, not even looking up from his laptop. "It's not healthy." I glanced at the stack of research papers scattered across our dining table, my laptop still warm from another late-night session analyzing molecular compounds. The apartment reeked of takeout containers and the faint chemical smell that seemed to follow me home from the lab every day. "This is important work, Marcus. Dr. Patterson thinks my research on carbon capture enzymes could—" He finally looked at me, his green eyes cold in a way that made my stomach drop. "Save the world. Elena, you're 27 years old. When was the last time we went on a real date? When was the last time you came to bed before midnight?" I opened my mouth to respond, but he wasn't finished. "Look around this place. Look at yourself." His voice was getting louder now, the way it did when he'd been drinking. "You've turned into some kind of mad scientist. Your hair's a mess. You live in those same 3 lab coats, and you talk about nothing but molecules and chemical reactions." The words hit harder than they should have. I caught my reflection in the black window, wild curls escaping from a messy bun, a coffee stain on my Northwestern sweatshirt, dark circles under my brown eyes from too many 18-hour days in the lab. "This research could actually help reverse climate change," I said quietly. "The applications for industrial carbon capture are Jesus Christ, Elena." Marcus slammed his laptop shut. "Do you hear yourself? This is exactly what I'm talking about. You can't have a normal conversation anymore. Everything is about your work." He stood up and started pacing around our small living room, running his hands through his perfectly styled blonde hair. Marcus worked in marketing for a tech startup, and he looked the part. Designer jeans, expensive sneakers, the kind of casual confidence that came from never having to question whether you belonged somewhere. "I'm trying to build something here," I said, my voice starting to shake. "Dr. Patterson says if my next round of experiments works, we could be looking at a breakthrough that what? What makes you famous? That gets you on magazine covers." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think you're going to change the world, but you're just another graduate student burning out in some basement lab." The silence that followed felt like a physical weight in the room. Outside, the storm was getting worse, and I could hear our upstairs neighbors moving around, probably getting ready for their normal Friday night plans. Date night, maybe. Something Marcus and I hadn't done in months. "I love what I do," I said finally. "More than you love me?" The question hung in the air between us. I wanted to say no, wanted to reassure him, but the truth was more complicated than that. My research wasn't just a job, or even just a passion. It felt like a calling. Every failed experiment brought me closer to something that could matter, something that could make a real difference. "It's not about choosing sides," I said. Marcus sat back down, but instead of returning to his laptop, he leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Elena, I've been patient. I've supported your dreams. I've paid more than my share of rent while you work for peanuts as a research assistant. But I can't keep doing this." "Doing what?" "Living with a ghost. You're never really here, even when you're here. Your mind is always somewhere else, always thinking about the next experiment, the next paper, the next conference." I looked around our apartment, really looked at it. He wasn't wrong. My research had taken over everything. Papers and textbooks covered every surface. My laptop was always open to some scientific journal, and I couldn't remember the last time we'd watched a movie together without me pausing it to jot down an idea. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. "I want you to choose. Me or the lab. A real life or this obsession. That's not fair. Life isn't fair, Elena. But relationships require compromise. They require showing up." He stood up again, this time walking to the window. "My buddy Jake just got engaged. Dave and Sarah bought a house last month. Everyone our age is moving forward, building real lives together. What are we building?" I didn't have an answer for that. What were we building? Our relationship had become a series of parallel lives that occasionally intersected over takeout dinners and hurried conversations about whose turn it was to do laundry. Dr. Patterson thinks I could have my breakthrough paper published within the year, I said, knowing even as I said it that it was the wrong thing to say. Marcus turned around slowly, and I saw something in his expression that I'd never seen before. Not anger, not frustration, but something colder. Resignation, maybe. There it is, he said quietly. Even now, when we're talking about us, about our future, you're talking about Dr. Patterson and your research, because it matters. To who? To you and 12 other scientists who understand what you're talking about? Elena, you're brilliant, but you're living in a fantasy. You think you're going to win a Nobel Prize or something, but the reality is that 99% of research leads nowhere. Most scientists spend their entire careers in obscurity, publishing papers that maybe 50 people will ever read. The cruelty of his words took my breath away. Not because they were mean, but because part of me was afraid he might be right. How many graduate students thought they were going to change the world? How many ended up as adjunct professors at community colleges, their grand dreams reduced to teaching basic chemistry to bored freshmen? I need some air, I said, grabbing my jacket from the chair. Where are you going? For a walk? Elena, it's pouring. But I was already at the door. I needed to get out of that apartment, away from Marcus's words and the weight of his disappointment. I needed to think. The Chicago streets were nearly empty, the rain having driven most people indoors. I walked without direction, my sneakers squelching through puddles, my hair getting soaked despite my hood. The city looked different in the rain. Sharper somehow, like all the soft edges had been washed away. I found myself at the university, standing outside the chemistry building where I'd spent most of my waking hours for the past 3 years. The building was dark except for a few scattered windows where other graduate students were probably working late, just like me. Was Marcus right? Was I deluding myself about the importance of my work? The research on carbon capture enzymes had consumed my life. But what if it led nowhere? What if I was just another graduate student chasing an impossible dream while my real life fell apart around me? I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my recent calls. Most of them were to Dr. Patterson, my research advisor, or to other graduate students in the program. When was the last time I'd called my sister? My parents? When was the last time I'd made plans with friends that didn't revolve around academic conferences or journal article discussions? Marcus's words echoed in my head. You're living with a ghost. Maybe he was right. Maybe I had become so focused on my future that I'd stopped living in the present. But the alternative, giving up on the research that felt like the most important thing I'd ever done, seemed impossible. I was still standing there, soaked and shivering, when my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Come home. We need to finish this conversation. The walk back to our apartment felt like walking to my own execution. I knew what was coming, could feel it in the way the storm seemed to be clearing, leaving behind that eerie calm that follows destruction. Marcus was waiting for me in the living room, my research papers neatly stacked on the coffee table. He'd made tea, which he only did when he was trying to soften bad news. Sit down, he said gently. I remained standing, water dripping from my jacket onto the hardwood floor. Elena, I love you. I need you to know that before I say what I'm going to say. My heart started pounding. But I can't do this anymore. I can't compete with your work for your attention. I can't build a life with someone who's already married to their research. Marcus, I'm moving out. The words hit me like a physical blow. Even though I'd seen this coming, even though our relationship had been deteriorating for months, hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way I wasn't prepared for. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. When? I managed to ask. This weekend. Jake said I can stay at his place until I find something permanent. I sank into the chair across from him, suddenly exhausted. Is there anything I can do? Any way we can work this out? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring into his tea. When he looked up, his expression was sadder than I'd ever seen it. You could quit, he said. You could find a normal job, something with regular hours, and we could try to build something real together. You know I can't do that. I know, and that's why this has to end. We sat in silence, the weight of 5 years together pressing down on us. All those memories, study sessions that turned into all-night conversations, weekend trips to Michigan, the way he used to bring me coffee during finals week, the morning he told me he loved me while we were brushing our teeth. Do you really think I'll never amount to anything? I asked quietly. Marcus looked at me with something that might have been pity. I think you're incredibly smart, Elena, but smart isn't enough. The world is full of brilliant people who never make it, who spend their lives chasing dreams that are too big for reality. He stood up and walked to the kitchen, rinsing out his mug with the methodical precision he brought to everything. You'll find someone who gets it, he said without turning around. Someone who understands your world better than I do. What if I don't want someone else? Then you'll have your research, and maybe that'll be enough. But his tone suggested he didn't think it would be. The next few days passed in a blur of boxes and awkward conversations about who owned what furniture. Marcus was efficient about it, the same way he was efficient about everything else. No drama, no big fights, just the systematic dismantling of a life we'd built together. The night before he left, we ordered pizza from the place we used to go to on our first date. It felt like a funeral for our relationship, both of us trying to be kind while avoiding anything that might make us cry. I hope you prove me wrong, Marcus said as we finished the last slice. I hope you do change the world. But I could tell he didn't really believe it would happen. On Sunday morning, I helped him load his boxes into Jake's truck. 5 years of shared life reduced to a dozen cardboard containers and 2 suitcases. Take care of yourself, he said, giving me a hug that felt like goodbye to more than just our relationship. You too. And then he was gone, leaving me alone in an apartment that suddenly felt enormous and impossibly quiet. I spent the rest of that day in the lab, losing myself in the familiar rhythm of experiments and data analysis. But when I came home that night to an empty apartment, Marcus's final words kept echoing in my head. You'll never find anyone better, not with the way you are. He hadn't said it to be cruel. It was delivered almost like a diagnosis, a clinical assessment of my prospects. And as I sat in our empty living room, surrounded by my research papers and the lingering smell of the chemicals that had become more familiar to me than my own boyfriend's cologne, I couldn't help wondering if he was right. The months following Marcus's departure blurred together in a haze of 18-hour lab sessions and instant ramen dinners. Without the anchor of a relationship keeping me tethered to normal human schedules, I drifted deeper into the isolated world of graduate research. The apartment felt cavernous now, every corner a reminder of the life I'd chosen to abandon. Dr. Patterson noticed the change immediately. Margaret Patterson had been overseeing graduate students for nearly 2 decades, and she had a sixth sense for recognizing when someone was using work as a refuge from personal trauma. Elena, when was the last time you went home? She asked one evening, finding me hunched over a spectrometer at nearly midnight. I am home, I replied without looking up from the readout displaying molecular absorption patterns. I mean your actual home, with a bed and a kitchen. I considered the question seriously. Tuesday? Wednesday? The days had started running together since Marcus left, marked only by the rhythm of experiments and the changing cast of undergraduate assistants who rotated through the lab during normal daylight hours. I'll head back soon, I lied. Elena. Dr. Patterson's voice carried the authority of someone who'd shepherded dozens of students through their doctoral programs. Burnout is real, and it's not glamorous. It doesn't make you a better scientist, it makes you a worse one. But I couldn't stop. The research had become more than an academic pursuit. It was a lifeline. Every successful synthesis, every promising data point, every small breakthrough felt like evidence that Marcus had been wrong about me. The carbon capture enzyme project wasn't just my dissertation anymore, it was my vindication. The work itself was maddeningly complex. I was attempting to engineer bacteria that could process atmospheric carbon dioxide at an unprecedented rate, essentially creating biological factories that could help reverse decades of industrial emissions. The theoretical framework was sound, but translating theory into functional organisms required a level of precision that bordered on the miraculous. Most days ended in failure. Bacterial cultures would die overnight, chemical reactions would produce unexpected byproducts, or promising enzyme variants would prove unstable under laboratory conditions. Each setback felt personal, as if the universe was confirming Marcus's prediction about my inevitable obscurity. The isolation was getting to me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Graduate school had always been solitary, but sharing my daily struggles with Marcus had provided a buffer against the crushing weight of constant intellectual challenge. Now my only regular human contact was with Dr. Patterson and a rotating cast of undergraduate lab assistants who seemed impossibly young and optimistic. You should come to the departmental mixer next Friday, suggested Jenny, a junior who was helping me with bacterial culture maintenance. Everyone's going to be there. I glanced up from the enzyme purification column I was monitoring. The idea of making small talk with professors and graduate students felt exhausting. What would I even talk about? My research was too specialized for casual conversation, and I hadn't read a book, watched a movie, or done anything remotely interesting outside the lab in months. Maybe next time, I said. That's what you said last time. Jenny wasn't wrong. I'd been declining social invitations since Marcus left, partially because I genuinely didn't have time, but mostly because being around happy, well-adjusted people made me feel like a cautionary tale. Look at Elena Martinez, the brilliant student who chose chemistry over human connection. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening in October, almost 6 months after the breakup. I'd been working on a particularly stubborn enzyme variant, one that showed promise in computer models but kept failing in actual bacterial cultures. The modification required inserting a synthetic gene sequence that would theoretically increase the enzyme's efficiency by 40%. I'd attempted the insertion 17 times over the past 2 weeks, each failure more frustrating than the last. The bacteria either rejected the foreign genetic material entirely or incorporated it in ways that rendered the organism non-viable. My lab notebook had become a chronicle of defeat, page after page of failed experiments and increasingly desperate modifications. But attempt number 18 was different. I noticed it first in the bacterial growth patterns. The modified organisms weren't just surviving, they were thriving. The cultures that should have taken 3 days to reach viable population levels were achieving the same density in less than 24 hours. More importantly, the carbon processing rates were unlike anything I'd seen before. I ran the initial tests 3 times, certain I'd made an error in measurement or calculation, but the numbers were consistent. The modified bacteria were processing atmospheric carbon dioxide at rates that exceeded my most optimistic projections by nearly 30%. By 2 in the morning, I had preliminary data that suggested I'd created something genuinely revolutionary. These weren't just slightly improved carbon capture organisms, they were fundamentally different biological machines that could potentially process atmospheric carbon at industrial scales. I called Dr. Patterson at home, something I'd never done before. "This better be good, Elena. It's 2:30 in the morning." "I think I did it," I said, my voice shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. "The enzyme modification worked. The carbon processing rates are incredible." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. How incredible? 30% above projections, maybe more. I need to run larger-scale tests. But Margaret, if these numbers hold up, we're looking at something that could actually make a difference. Don't get ahead of yourself. Run the tests again tomorrow with fresh cultures. If the results are reproducible, we'll talk about next steps. But I could hear the excitement in her voice, carefully controlled but unmistakably present. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I spent the hours before dawn preparing additional cultures, checking and rechecking my calculations, and documenting every aspect of the successful modification. The lab felt different somehow, charged with possibility in a way it hadn't since I'd started the project. The follow-up experiments over the next week confirmed what I'd hardly dared to hope. The modified bacteria weren't just a minor improvement, they represented a genuine breakthrough in biological carbon capture technology. The implications were staggering. "We need to talk about publication strategy," Dr. Patterson said after reviewing my latest batch of results. "This is nature-level work, Elena. Maybe science. These findings could reshape how we think about atmospheric carbon management." The words felt surreal. For months, I'd been grinding through experiment after experiment with nothing to show for it but a growing collection of failed attempts. Now, suddenly, I was sitting on research that could potentially influence global climate policy. "What's the timeline for publication?" I asked. "If we push hard, we could have a manuscript ready for submission within 2 months, but we'll need additional validation studies, peer review from other labs, and probably some collaboration with environmental engineering departments to model real-world applications." The next several weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity unlike anything I'd experienced in graduate school. Word of the breakthrough spread quickly through the chemistry department, then to other universities, then to government agencies and private research institutions that specialized in climate change mitigation. Suddenly, everyone wanted to meet with me. Representatives from the Environmental Protection Agency scheduled a video call to discuss potential applications. A startup company focused on carbon capture technology offered to fund expanded research. Other graduate students who'd barely acknowledged my existence began asking detailed questions about my methodology. The attention was overwhelming and exhilarating in equal measure. For the first time since Marcus left, I felt like I was living in the present rather than just surviving it. The research had given me something I didn't realize I'd been missing, proof that my choices had been correct. But success brought its own complications. The university's technology transfer office became involved, raising questions about intellectual property and commercial applications. Patent lawyers wanted to understand the broader implications of my work. Environmental advocacy groups reached out about publicity opportunities. "This is getting bigger than a dissertation," Dr. Patterson warned during one of our weekly meetings. "You need to be prepared for the possibility that this research could define your entire career." The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying. I'd spent so long focused on just proving that my approach could work that I hadn't seriously considered what would happen if it actually succeeded beyond my wildest expectations. Meanwhile, my personal life remained largely unchanged. I was still living alone in the same apartment, still eating most of my meals at the lab bench, still going days without meaningful conversation outside of academic contexts. The research breakthrough had validated my professional choices, but it hadn't solved the fundamental isolation that had developed since Marcus left. I found myself thinking about him more often as the magnitude of my discovery became clear. Part of me wanted to call him, to share the news with someone who'd known me before I became the graduate student with the carbon capture breakthrough, but pride held me back. What would I even say? "Remember when you said I'd never amount to anything? Well, I might be about to change the world." The pettiness of that impulse bothered me. I didn't want my success to be defined by proving an ex-boyfriend wrong. I wanted it to matter on its own terms, as a contribution to human knowledge and environmental preservation that transcended personal vindication. But late at night, when I was alone in the lab running yet another validation experiment, I couldn't help imagining what Marcus would think when he eventually heard about my work. Would he be proud? Embarrassed about his predictions? Indifferent? The fantasy scenarios I created in my head during those long evening hours were simultaneously satisfying and pathetic. I pictured him seeing my name in newspapers, watching me give interviews on television, realizing that the woman he'd dismissed as obsessed and unrealistic had achieved something genuinely significant. But these daydreams always left me feeling hollow afterward. What kind of person builds their sense of accomplishment around proving someone else wrong? What did it say about me that I couldn't enjoy my success without imagining how it might affect someone who was no longer part of my life? Dr. Patterson seemed to sense my emotional complexity around the breakthrough. "How are you handling all this attention?" she asked one afternoon as we reviewed the latest round of validation data from collaborating laboratories. "It's overwhelming," I admitted. "Good, overwhelming, but still overwhelming." "And personally, are you taking care of yourself outside the lab?" The question caught me off guard, because the honest answer was that I barely had a life outside the lab. My routine had become so centered around research that I'd forgotten how to exist as a complete human being. "I'm fine," I said automatically. "Elena, I've been supervising graduate students for 20 years. I've seen brilliant people burn out spectacularly right at the moment of their greatest success. Don't let that happen to you." Her concern was touching, but it also highlighted how thoroughly I'd isolated myself from normal human support systems. Dr. Patterson was probably the person who knew me best at this point, and our relationship was fundamentally professional. That evening, I made an unusual decision. I left the lab at 7 o'clock and went home to cook an actual meal. The apartment felt strange during normal dinner hours, as if I was visiting someone else's life. I found ingredients in my kitchen that I'd forgotten I owned, and attempted to make something more complex than microwaved leftovers. While the pasta was boiling, I called my sister Carmen in Los Angeles. We hadn't spoken in weeks, and I realized I hadn't told her about the research breakthrough at all. "Elena, how are you? I was starting to worry since you never call anymore." "I'm good. Actually, I'm really good. I think I might have made a major breakthrough with my research." "That's amazing. Tell me everything." As I explained the carbon capture work to Carmen, I realized how long it had been since I'd talked about my research with someone who wasn't a scientist. She asked different questions than my academic colleagues, more focused on real-world applications and less concerned with technical methodology. "So this could actually help with climate change?" she asked. "Like, in a meaningful way?" "Potentially, yes. If we can scale it up and make it economically viable, it could process atmospheric carbon dioxide at rates that might actually make a difference." "Elena, That's incredible. You could literally help save the planet. Hearing her say it so directly, without the careful academic qualifications that surrounded all professional discussions of my work, made the implications feel more real. I wasn't just writing a dissertation or advancing scientific knowledge. I was potentially contributing to solutions for one of the most pressing challenges facing humanity. "How's Marcus handling all this success?" Carmen asked casually. The question hit me like cold water. I hadn't mentioned the breakup to anyone in my family, partly out of embarrassment and partly because I'd been too consumed with work to have normal familial conversations. "We're not together anymore," I said quietly. "What? Elena, when did this happen? Why didn't you tell me?" The conversation that followed was more emotionally honest than any I'd had in months. I told Carmen about the deteriorating relationship, about Marcus's ultimatum, about the loneliness and isolation that had followed his departure. But I also talked about how the research had become my lifeline, how the breakthrough had given me a sense of purpose that transcended personal relationships. "Do you miss him?" Carmen asked. The question was more complicated than it should have been. Did I miss Marcus specifically, or did I miss having someone to share my daily experiences with? Did I miss our relationship, or just the idea of not being alone? "Sometimes," I said honestly, "but I think I miss the idea of him more than I miss him specifically." "What do you mean?" "I miss having someone to call when something good happens. I miss having someone who cares about the details of my day. But I don't think I miss Marcus himself. We'd grown apart long before he moved out." As I said it, I realized it was true. The relationship had been failing not just because of my work schedule, but because we'd become fundamentally incompatible people. Marcus wanted a conventional life with predictable milestones and normal social rhythms. I wanted to pursue research that could contribute to solving global problems, even if it meant sacrificing traditional markers of success and happiness. "Do you think you made the right choice?" Carmen asked. I looked around my empty apartment, then thought about the bacterial cultures growing in the lab, the data that might contribute to reversing climate change, the possibility that my work could matter in ways I'd never imagined. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "I think I did." The manuscript submission to Nature was simultaneously the most terrifying and exhilarating moment of my academic career. After 3 months of intensive peer review, additional experiments, and collaboration with environmental engineering teams at MIT and Stanford, we'd compiled what Dr. Patterson called the most comprehensive carbon capture study she'd seen in 2 decades. The peer review process felt like an eternity. Every day I checked my email obsessively, waiting for either acceptance or the crushing rejection that could derail everything I'd worked toward. Meanwhile, interest from outside the academic world continued to escalate in ways I'd never anticipated. The Department of Energy had allocated preliminary funding for expanded research. A Norwegian environmental technology company flew representatives to Chicago specifically to discuss licensing opportunities. Most surprisingly, the United Nations Environmental Program had reached out about presenting my preliminary findings at their annual climate summit in Geneva. "You need to prepare for the possibility that your life is about to change dramatically," Dr. Patterson warned as we waited for Nature's final decision. "Once this research goes public, you won't be just another graduate student anymore." The weight of that statement didn't fully hit me until I received the acceptance email on a cold February morning. I was in the lab preparing bacterial cultures when my phone buzzed with the message that would reshape everything. "Manuscript accepted for publication in Nature. Expected publication date March 15th. I stared at the email for several minutes, reading it over and over to make sure I wasn't hallucinating from sleep deprivation. Elena Martinez, the graduate student whose boyfriend had left her for being too obsessed with work, was about to be published in the most prestigious scientific journal in the world. The tears came without warning, months of stress and isolation and doubt finally breaking through the professional composure I'd maintained throughout the research process. Dr. Patterson found me sobbing over my phone in the bacterial culture room, mascara streaming down my face. "Good news or bad news?" she asked gently. "Nature accepted the manuscript," I managed between sobs. Her usually composed expression broke into the biggest smile I'd ever seen from her. "Elena, do you understand what this means? This isn't just a publication. This could fundamentally change how we approach atmospheric carbon management." But even as I celebrated with Dr. Patterson and the other lab members, part of my mind kept drifting to Marcus. The urge to call him, to share this moment with someone who'd known me before I became the carbon capture researcher, was almost overwhelming. But what would I say? How do you contact someone who predicted your failure to announce your spectacular success? The publication process moved quickly after acceptance. Nature's editors worked with us on final revisions, fact-checking, and the creation of supplementary materials that would allow other researchers to replicate our results. They also began planning the media strategy around the article's release, something I hadn't expected or prepared for.
This is going to get significant press coverage, the communications director from Nature explained during a video call. Carbon capture is a high-priority topic right now, and your results are genuinely groundbreaking. We're planning coordinated releases to major science journalists, and you should expect interview requests from multiple media outlets. The concept of giving interviews felt surreal. I'd spent the past year and a half talking almost exclusively to other scientists about my research. The idea of explaining carbon capture enzymes to journalists and potentially television audiences was both exciting and terrifying. The first interview request came from the Chicago Tribune's science reporter who wanted to do a feature story about local research making a global impact. Then came requests from Scientific American, The Washington Post, and several online science publications. Within a week of Nature's acceptance, my calendar was filling up with media commitments I'd never imagined having. The most unexpected request came from Dr. James Morrison at Harvard's Environmental Science Department. He'd apparently been following my research through professional networks and wanted to discuss potential postdoctoral opportunities. Elena, your work on carbon capture enzymes is exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need in our climate solutions program, he said during our video call. Have you considered what you'd like to do after completing your dissertation? The question caught me off guard. For so long I'd been focused on just proving that my research could work that I hadn't seriously planned beyond graduation. The possibility of continuing this work at one of the world's most prestigious universities felt like something from someone else's life. I'd definitely be interested in discussing opportunities, I said, trying to sound more composed than I felt. We have a postdoc position that would be perfect for expanding your research, full funding, access to our industrial partnerships, and the opportunity to work on real-world implementation of your findings. Are you free to visit Cambridge next month? After the call ended, I sat in my apartment trying to process how rapidly my life was changing. 6 months ago, I'd been a struggling graduate student whose personal life had imploded. Now I was fielding job offers from Harvard and preparing for a media tour about research that could influence global climate policy. The Nature article was published online on March 15th, followed by the print edition a week later. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The university's public relations department started fielding calls from journalists, government agencies, and environmental organizations within hours of the online publication. My email inbox became a constant stream of interview requests, collaboration proposals, and congratulatory messages from scientists around the world. The administrative assistant in our department had to create a separate phone line just to handle media inquiries about my research. The most surreal moment came when I received a call from a producer at 60 Minutes. They wanted to do a segment about young scientists working on climate solutions, and my research had been recommended by several environmental policy experts. We're particularly interested in the human story behind the science, the producer explained. How did you get interested in this field? What drove you to pursue such ambitious research? What obstacles did you overcome? As I prepared for the interview, I found myself thinking about those obstacles in ways I hadn't before. The isolation, the failed experiments, the relationship that ended because I couldn't balance personal and professional commitments. They'd all been necessary parts of the journey that led to this breakthrough. The 60 Minutes interview was filmed at the university lab where I'd spent countless 18-hour days perfecting the enzyme modification. Being interviewed in that space, surrounded by the equipment that had made the discovery possible, felt like coming full circle. What would you say to young people who are interested in science but worried about the personal sacrifices required? The interviewer asked. I thought about Marcus, about the choices I'd made, about the loneliness that had driven me deeper into my research until it became the thing that saved me. Science requires dedication that can feel overwhelming sometimes, I said carefully. But if you're working on something that genuinely matters to you, something that could make a real difference in the world, then the sacrifices become meaningful. They become part of the story of how you contributed to something larger than yourself. The segment aired 3 weeks later, reaching an audience of millions of people who learned about carbon capture research for the first time through my story. The response was unlike anything I'd experienced. My university email was filled up with messages from high school students asking about careers in environmental science, from other researchers wanting to collaborate, and from environmental activists expressing gratitude for the work.
But the message that affected me most came from an unexpected source. 2 days after the 60-minute segment aired, I received a text from Marcus. Saw you on TV. Incredible work, Elena. I always knew you were brilliant. Even if I couldn't understand what you were trying to accomplish, congratulations. The text was brief and careful, but it represented a kind of closure I hadn't realized I needed. Not vindication or triumph over his doubts, but simple acknowledgement that the path I'd chosen had led somewhere meaningful. I didn't respond immediately. What could I say that wouldn't sound either petty or performative? Instead, I saved the message and returned to the ever-growing pile of professional opportunities that were reshaping my future. The Harvard postdoc offer was officially extended in April, along with similar opportunities from Stanford, MIT, and the University of California at Berkeley. For the first time in my academic career, I was choosing between options rather than desperately hoping for any opportunity at all. The decision-making process felt surreal. These were institutions I'd dreamed of working at but never seriously expected to have access to. Now I was evaluating which environment would best support the next phase of research that could potentially influence global environmental policy. I chose Harvard, partly because of Dr. Morrison's vision for expanding the research, but mostly because they were offering the resources to move beyond laboratory-scale experiments toward real-world implementation. The position came with funding to establish a dedicated carbon capture research lab and connections to policymakers who could help translate scientific findings into actual environmental interventions. The transition from graduate student to postdoctoral researcher felt like stepping into a completely different life. Harvard provided an apartment in Cambridge, a research budget that dwarfed anything I'd worked with at Northwestern, and access to collaborators across multiple disciplines who were all focused on climate solutions. But the most significant change was psychological. For the first time since starting graduate school, I felt like I belonged in the spaces I occupied. Conferences that had once intimidated me now felt like gatherings of peers. Journal editors who had once seemed impossibly remote now reached out directly to discuss potential publications. The carbon capture research continued to evolve and expand. Working with environmental engineers, we began developing scaled-up systems that could potentially process atmospheric carbon at industrial levels. Policy researchers helped model the economic implications of widespread implementation. International collaborators started pilot programs in different climate conditions. Each advancement felt like another validation of the choices I'd made, another piece of evidence that the isolation and sacrifice had been worthwhile. But success also brought unexpected challenges. Dating became complicated in ways I hadn't anticipated. How do you explain to someone on a first date that you're the researcher behind a carbon capture breakthrough that's been featured in international media? How do you navigate relationships when your work has become a significant part of your public identity? The few romantic connections I attempted felt awkward and unbalanced. Either people were intimidated by my professional achievements, or they were attracted to the public recognition rather than to me as a person. The result was a continued isolation, different from the loneliness I'd experienced as a struggling graduate student, but isolation nonetheless. Patterson, who had become more mentor than supervisor, noticed my struggles with the personal implications of professional success. Fame in science is different from other kinds of recognition, she told me during one of our regular check-ins. It can be isolating because so few people understand what you actually do or why it matters. You need to find your community carefully. Her advice proved prescient when I was invited to speak at the International Climate Research Consortium's annual conference in Copenhagen. The gathering brought together several hundred researchers working on different aspects of climate science, all dealing with similar challenges of translating complex scientific work into public understanding and policy implementation. For the first time since my research had gained international attention, I was surrounded by people who understood both the intellectual challenges and the personal pressures of high-stakes environmental science. Conversations flowed naturally between technical discussions and shared experiences of navigating public scrutiny while maintaining scientific integrity. It was at that conference that I met Dr. Sarah Chen, an atmospheric physicist from UCLA, whose research on solar radiation management had gained similar international attention. Over dinner in Copenhagen, we compared notes on everything from media training to maintaining personal relationships while building careers around world-changing research. The hardest part isn't the science, Sarah said as we walked along the harbor after the conference sessions ended. It's figuring out how to be a complete human being when your work becomes your identity. Her words resonated more deeply than anything I'd heard in months. The scientific breakthrough had given me professional validation and opened doors I'd never imagined walking through, but it had also created a version of myself that sometimes felt as isolating as the graduate school years, just in different ways. As I prepared to return to Cambridge and the next phase of research that would determine whether laboratory discoveries could become real-world solutions, I realized that success had solved some problems while creating others. The girl who'd chosen science over her relationship with Marcus had achieved everything she'd dreamed of professionally, but the question of whether she could build a complete life around that success remained unanswered. 2 years into my Harvard postdoc, the carbon capture research had evolved far beyond anything I'd imagined during those lonely nights in the Northwestern lab. Our team had successfully implemented pilot programs in 12 countries, processing atmospheric carbon dioxide at scales that were beginning to show measurable environmental impact. The modified bacteria I'd developed in graduate school had become the foundation for a new industry. But nothing could have prepared me for the phone call that came at 5:47 a.m. on a crisp October morning in Boston. I was barely conscious when my phone rang, fumbling for it in the darkness of my Cambridge apartment. The international number didn't register immediately, and I almost sent it to voicemail before deciding to answer. Dr. Martinez, this is Secretary General Anderson from the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. I'm calling to inform you that you have been awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for your groundbreaking work in atmospheric carbon capture using engineered biological systems. The words felt like they were coming from underwater. I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake but unable to process what I was hearing. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? Congratulations on this extraordinary achievement. After the call ended, I sat in my dark apartment for several minutes, staring at my phone and wondering if I'd dreamed the entire conversation. The Nobel Prize, at 29 years old. For research that had started as a desperate attempt to prove my ex-boyfriend wrong about my potential. The irony wasn't lost on me. The phone started ringing again almost immediately. Dr. Morrison from Harvard, my parents, Carmen, reporters, colleagues from around the world. Within 30 minutes, my apartment had become the center of a media storm I was completely unprepared for. The Harvard public relations team arrived at my door before I'd even had coffee, ready to manage what they called the biggest story in the university's recent history. Camera crews from major networks were setting up outside the building. My quiet academic life had been shattered by a single phone call from Sweden. Elena, how does it feel to be the youngest chemistry Nobel laureate in over a century? Asked the first reporter who managed to corner me outside my apartment building. The question felt impossible to answer honestly. How do you explain that winning the Nobel Prize feels both like the culmination of everything you've worked for and completely surreal? How do you describe the sensation of achieving something you'd fantasized about but never truly believed would happen? It's overwhelming, I said, which was the most honest response I could manage while cameras flashed around me. This recognition belongs not just to me but to everyone who supported this research and believed in its potential. The day passed in a blur of interviews, phone calls, and congratulatory messages from scientists, politicians, and strangers around the world. The Nobel Committee had praised not just the scientific innovation, but the real-world impact of implementing carbon capture technology at industrial scales. But amid all the celebration and media attention, I found myself thinking about Marcus. He would know by now. The Nobel Prize announcement had been covered by every major news outlet, and my face was probably on television screens across the country. The woman he'd dismissed as obsessed and unrealistic had just received the highest honor in science. I wondered what he was thinking, whether he remembered his prediction that I'd never amount to anything, whether he felt embarrassed or proud, or simply indifferent. The vindication I'd fantasized about for years was finally complete, but it felt different than I'd expected. Less satisfying, more complicated. The Nobel Foundation's call came 3 days later, outlining the ceremony procedures and timeline. I would travel to Stockholm in December to receive the award from the King of Sweden, deliver the traditional Nobel lecture, and participate in the week-long celebration that accompanies the prizes. This is going to change your life permanently, warned Dr. Sarah Chen during a congratulatory video call. Nobel laureates become public figures in ways that other scientists don't. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? The question was prescient. Within a week of the announcement, I was receiving speaking invitations from organizations around the world, book deal offers from major publishers, and requests to serve on advisory boards for environmental policy groups. The carbon capture research had made me professionally successful, but the Nobel Prize was transforming me into a public intellectual. The most unexpected invitation came from the White House. The president wanted to meet with me about incorporating carbon capture technology into national climate policy. The meeting was scheduled for 2 weeks before the Stockholm ceremony, giving me just enough time to prepare for what felt like the most important policy conversation of my career. Walking into the Oval Office felt like stepping into someone else's life. The president, whom I'd only seen on television and in newspapers, greeted me with genuine enthusiasm about the environmental implications of my research. Dr. Martinez, your work represents exactly the kind of American innovation we need to lead global climate solutions, she said, settling into one of the chairs arranged around the presidential seal carpet. Tell me about the potential for scaling this technology nationally. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, covering everything from manufacturing logistics to international cooperation on carbon capture implementation. As I explained the technical aspects of enzymatic carbon processing to the leader of the free world, I couldn't help thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 3 years ago, I'd been crying in a Chicago apartment while my boyfriend packed his belongings and predicted my inevitable failure. Now I was advising the President of the United States on environmental policy based on research that could help save the planet. The Stockholm trip in December was unlike anything I'd experienced. The Nobel Prize ceremony is a week-long celebration of human achievement, bringing together laureates, dignitaries, and scientists from around the world. The other prize winners that year included a literature laureate whose novels I'd read in college, a Peace Prize winner whose human rights work had influenced international law, and a physics team whose quantum computing research was reshaping technology. Being included in this group felt surreal. These were people whose work had fundamentally changed human understanding and capability. I was a graduate student who'd gotten lucky with bacterial enzyme modification. Imposter syndrome never really goes away, confided the literature laureate during one of the pre-ceremony dinners. I keep expecting someone to tell me there's been a mistake, that they meant to call someone else. Her words were reassuring, but they didn't diminish the overwhelming nature of the week's events. There were lectures to attend, formal dinners with Swedish royalty, interviews with international media, and the constant awareness that everything I said and did was being documented for posterity. The Nobel lecture, delivered to an audience of scientists and dignitaries at the Stockholm Concert Hall, felt like the most important speech I would ever give. I'd spent weeks crafting remarks that would explain the technical aspects of carbon capture research, while making the broader implications accessible to a general audience. Science advances through the accumulated work of countless researchers, each building on the discoveries of those who came before. I began, looking out at an audience that included some of the most accomplished people in the world. My research on carbon capture enzymes represents not individual brilliance, but the power of persistent curiosity applied to humanity's greatest challenges. As I described the journey from failed graduate school experiments to global climate solutions, I thought about all the people who'd supported this work. Dr. Patterson, who'd guided me through the darkest periods of research, my family, who'd believed in my potential even when I doubted it myself, the undergraduate assistants who'd helped with countless bacterial cultures, even Marcus, whose departure had forced me to find strength and purpose in solitude. The ceremony itself was a spectacle of Swedish tradition and scientific celebration. Wearing the formal gown required for Nobel laureates, I walked across the stage of Stockholm Concert Hall to receive the prize from King Carl XVI Gustaf, while the Royal Stockholm Philharmonic Orchestra played in the background. For revolutionary advances in atmospheric carbon capture using engineered biological systems, contributing to global climate solutions, the king announced as he presented the gold medal and diploma. The weight of the medal in my hands felt symbolic of more than just scientific achievement. It represented vindication for every choice I'd made, every sacrifice I'd endured, every moment of doubt I'd overcome during the long journey from struggling graduate student to Nobel laureate. But the moment that affected me most came during the Nobel banquet, the formal dinner that concludes the prize ceremony. As I sat at the head table surrounded by Swedish royalty and fellow laureates, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Elena, I saw the ceremony on television. I've been following your work since the Nature publication, and I want you to know how proud I am of what you've accomplished. You proved that dedication and brilliance can literally change the world. I was wrong about so many things, but I was especially wrong about you. Congratulations on an achievement that will inspire generations of scientists. Marcus. The message was longer and more thoughtful than I'd expected. Reading it while surrounded by the pageantry of the Nobel celebration felt like closing a chapter that had remained open for years. Marcus's approval no longer mattered for my sense of self-worth, but his acknowledgement provided a kind of emotional resolution I hadn't realized I needed. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I looked around the banquet hall at the other laureates, at the dignitaries celebrating human achievement, at the representatives from universities and governments who were already discussing how to expand carbon capture technology globally. This was my life now, not the isolated existence of a struggling graduate student, not the complicated fame of a rising scientist, but the established recognition of someone whose work had permanently influenced human capability and understanding. The girl who'd chosen science over romance, who'd endured loneliness and failure and doubt, had achieved something that would outlast any personal relationship. The carbon capture technology was already being implemented worldwide, processing atmospheric carbon dioxide at scales that were beginning to reverse decades of environmental damage. But more than the global impact, more than the professional recognition, more than the vindication of choices made during dark moments of uncertainty, the Nobel Prize represented proof that pursuing something larger than yourself, even at tremendous personal cost, could lead to contributions that justify every sacrifice. As the evening concluded and I prepared to return to Cambridge and the next phase of research that would build on this foundation, I realized that Marcus had been both completely wrong and inadvertently correct about my future. He'd predicted I would never find anyone better than him. In the narrow sense of romantic relationships, he might still be right. My dedication to world-changing science had made traditional partnerships challenging in ways I was still learning to navigate. But he'd failed to understand that better could mean something entirely different. I'd found purpose that transcended personal relationships, work that contributed to humanity's greatest challenges, and recognition for achievements that would influence generations of scientists and environmental policy. I hadn't found someone better than Marcus, I'd found something better than the life he'd offered me. And standing on that stage in Stockholm, holding the Nobel Prize while the world watched, I knew with absolute certainty that I'd made the right choice. The woman who'd been told she'd never amount to anything had just received the highest honor in science for work that could help save the planet. That felt like the best possible response to anyone who'd ever doubted what was possible when you choose purpose over convention, dedication over comfort, and the future of humanity over the approval of people who can't understand your vision. The Nobel Prize wasn't just recognition for scientific achievement, it was vindication for every unconventional choice, every moment of solitude, every sacrifice made in service of something larger than personal happiness. And as I looked out at the cameras broadcasting this moment around the world, I hoped that somewhere, another young scientist was watching and realizing that the most extraordinary achievements often require the courage to disappoint people who can't see beyond their own limitations. Returning to Cambridge after Stockholm felt like landing in a parallel universe. The same apartment, the same lab, the same coffee shop on the corner, but everything had changed because I had changed. The Nobel Prize medal sat in a place of honor on my bookshelf, catching the morning light that streamed through my apartment windows, a constant reminder that the life I was living was no longer the one I'd planned. The immediate aftermath of winning brought opportunities I'd never imagined. Publishers were bidding against each other for the rights to my autobiography. Documentary filmmakers wanted to chronicle the carbon capture breakthrough. Universities across the globe were offering endowed chair positions with salaries that dwarfed anything I'd ever expected to earn as a scientist. But the most unexpected invitation came from an organization I'd never heard of, the Meridian Foundation, a private research institute that funded what they called moonshot science, ambitious projects aimed at solving humanity's most pressing challenges. Dr. Martinez, we've been following your work since the early publications, explained Dr. Victoria Chen, the Foundation's director, during a video call that interrupted my Tuesday morning lab routine. We're prepared to offer you something unprecedented, a fully funded research institute with a staff of 50 unlimited resources and complete autonomy to pursue whatever scientific questions interest you most. The offer was staggering. My own research institute with the freedom to explore any avenue of scientific inquiry that captured my imagination. It was the kind of opportunity that most scientists could only dream of, the sort of position that might come once in a generation. What's the catch? I asked, because offers this generous always came with strings attached. No catch. We want to give you the resources to continue changing the world. The only requirement is that you maintain the same spirit of ambitious research that led to the carbon capture breakthrough. After the call ended, I sat in my Harvard lab surrounded by the equipment and bacterial cultures that had become my professional home. The offer forced me to confront a question I'd been avoiding. What did I want to do with the rest of my life? The carbon capture work was largely complete from a research perspective. Other teams around the world were handling implementation and scaling. My role had become more advisory than experimental, consulting on policy and applications rather than discovering new science. For the first time since graduate school, I was facing an open-ended future without a clear next project driving my daily routine. The uncertainty was both liberating and terrifying. I'd spent so many years focused on proving that carbon capture was possible that I hadn't seriously considered what would come after success. Now, with unlimited resources and global recognition, I could pursue any scientific question that interested me. The decision process was complicated by personal factors I'd been neglecting since the Nobel announcement. The constant travel, media attention, and professional obligations had made dating nearly impossible. At 30 years old, I was perhaps the most professionally successful person I knew, but my personal life remained as isolated as it had been during graduate school. The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus had left because he felt I was too obsessed with work to maintain a relationship. Now, years later, my work had brought me international recognition and financial security, but I was still fundamentally alone. Dr. Sarah Chen, who had become one of my closest friends in the scientific community, noticed my ambivalence about the foundation offer during one of our regular video calls. "You don't seem excited about having your own research institute," she observed. "Most scientists would kill for this opportunity." "I am excited," I said, though I could hear the uncertainty in my voice. "It's just I don't know what comes next. The carbon capture work is done. I proved what I set out to prove. What's the next challenge that justifies this level of resources?" "Maybe that's the wrong question," Sarah suggested. "Maybe instead of asking what's the next world-changing discovery, you should ask what kind of life you want to build around your work." Her words hit harder than I'd expected. For years, I'd defined myself entirely through professional achievement. The relationship with Marcus had ended because I couldn't balance work and personal life. The Nobel Prize had validated my choice to prioritize science over conventional relationships. But what came after validation? The answer came from an unexpected source. 2 weeks after the foundation call, I received an email from Dr. James Wright, an environmental policy researcher at Oxford, who'd been following my work on carbon capture implementation. "Dr. Martinez, I'm writing to propose a collaboration that might interest you. We're establishing a new interdisciplinary program focused on training the next generation of scientist activists, researchers who can both make discoveries and translate them into real-world impact. Would you consider joining us as a founding faculty member?" The proposal intrigued me more than the foundation offer had. Teaching had never been part of my career plans, but the idea of mentoring young scientists who were passionate about solving global challenges felt like a natural extension of my own journey. I scheduled a visit to Oxford for the following month, partly to explore the teaching opportunity, but mostly to gain perspective on what I actually wanted to do with the platform the Nobel Prize had provided. Oxford in spring was gorgeous, all ancient stone buildings and students cycling between lectures under canopies of blooming trees. The university felt both timeless and urgently contemporary, a place where traditions dating back centuries coexisted with cutting-edge research into humanity's most pressing challenges. Dr. Wright showed me around the proposed program facilities, introducing me to faculty members who were developing curricula that combined rigorous science training with policy analysis, communication skills, and ethical framework for translating research into social impact. "The goal isn't just to train excellent scientists," he explained as we toured the laboratory spaces that would house the new program. "We want to graduate researchers who can bridge the gap between discovery and implementation, who understand that scientific knowledge is only valuable if it can be applied to real problems." The philosophy resonated deeply with my own experience. The carbon capture research had succeeded not just because of the technical breakthrough, but because I'd learned to communicate its importance to policymakers, journalists, and the general public. The most brilliant discovery in the world was worthless if it remained trapped in academic journals. But the moment that convinced me to seriously consider the Oxford position came during a dinner with current graduate students who were already working on climate solutions research. Their passion reminded me of my own graduate school years, but they seemed more sophisticated about the broader implications of their work. "Dr. Martinez, your research basically created a new field," said Rachel, a third-year student studying atmospheric chemistry. "But what we're learning from your example is that science is only half the challenge. The other half is figuring out how to make the solutions politically and economically viable." "How do you balance the pressure to publish with the pressure to create real impact?" asked another student, David, whose research focused on renewable energy storage. "It seems like the academic incentive system doesn't always reward the kind of work that actually changes the world." Their questions were more sophisticated than anything I'd considered during my own graduate training. These students were thinking systematically about how to translate scientific discoveries into social change, how to navigate the complex intersection of research, policy, and public communication. Spending time with them reminded me why I'd fallen in love with science in the first place, not just the intellectual challenge of understanding how the world works, but the possibility of using that understanding to make life better for people everywhere. By the end of my Oxford visit, I'd made my decision. The foundation offer was generous, but it would essentially make me a well-funded hermit, pursuing research in isolation from the broader world. The teaching position would allow me to multiply my impact by training the next generation of scientists who could continue the work of translating discoveries into solutions. I called Dr. Wright from the airport before my flight back to Boston. "I'm interested in the position," I said, "but I'd like to maintain an active research program alongside teaching. And I'd like to focus specifically on training scientists who are committed to working on climate solutions." "That's exactly what we had in mind," he replied. "Welcome to Oxford, Dr. Martinez." The transition from Harvard to Oxford took 6 months to arrange, involving visa applications, research equipment transfers, and the complicated logistics of moving an entire scientific career across an ocean. But the most challenging aspect was psychological, letting go of the identity I'd built around being the carbon capture researcher. At Oxford, I would be starting fresh in some ways, building new collaborations and taking on responsibilities I'd never had before. The Nobel Prize would always be part of my biography, but it couldn't be my entire professional identity for the next 30 years of my career. The farewell dinner at Harvard was attended by colleagues who'd become family during my postdoc years. Dr. Morrison gave a speech about the impact of my research, but the comments that meant the most came from the undergraduate students who'd worked in my lab. "Dr. Martinez, you taught us that science isn't just about making discoveries," said Katie, a senior who'd helped with enzyme purification for the past 2 years. "You showed us that researchers have a responsibility to make sure their work actually helps people." As I packed up my Cambridge apartment, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The Nobel Prize had been the culmination of one chapter of my life, but it was also the beginning of something new. The medal itself would come with me to Oxford, a reminder of what was possible when you committed yourself completely to work that mattered. But more importantly, I was carrying forward the conviction that the best science happened when researchers took responsibility, not just for making discoveries, but for ensuring those discoveries became tools for improving the world. My personal life remained complicated. The move to Oxford offered opportunities to meet new people, potentially to find the kind of relationship that could coexist with a career dedicated to changing the world. But I was no longer defining my worth through romantic relationships or seeking to prove anything to ex-boyfriends who doubted my potential. The night before leaving for England, I did something I hadn't done since receiving Marcus's congratulatory text after the Nobel ceremony. I sent him a message. "Marcus, I wanted you to know that I'm moving to Oxford to teach the next generation of scientists working on climate solutions. The carbon capture work was just the beginning. Thank you for helping me understand that I needed to choose between conventional happiness and the possibility of contributing to something larger than myself. I chose correctly." I didn't expect a response, and I didn't need one. The message was less about communicating with Marcus than about acknowledging how far I'd traveled from the person I'd been during our relationship. The woman who'd cried in that Chicago apartment while her boyfriend predicted her failure had become someone who could shape the education of future scientists, whose research had influenced global environmental policy, and whose work would continue long after she was gone. Standing in my empty Cambridge apartment, surrounded by boxes containing the equipment and research notes that represented years of dedicated work, I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete confidence in the life I'd chosen to build. The Nobel Prize had been validated, but it wasn't the endpoint. It was permission to dream even bigger, to take on challenges that required not just scientific brilliance, but the ability to inspire others to continue the work of solving humanity's greatest problems. As I boarded the plane to London, I thought about the students I would meet at Oxford, the research collaborations that would develop, the discoveries that might emerge from the intersection of rigorous science and passionate commitment to making the world better. Marcus had been wrong about my prospects for finding someone better, but he'd also been wrong about what better could mean. I'd found something better than any relationship, a life dedicated to work that would outlast any individual achievement, research that would continue to matter long after the people who created it were gone. The carbon capture breakthrough had been the beginning, not the end, and the best part of my story was still being written. 5 years into my tenure at Oxford, I was sitting in my office overlooking the college gardens when a familiar notification chimed on my laptop. Another carbon capture facility had come online in Bangladesh, the 47th installation based on my original research. The environmental impact reports showed atmospheric carbon dioxide levels dropping for the third consecutive year, the first sustained decrease since industrialization began. But what struck me most wasn't the global environmental data. It was the name of the facility's lead engineer, Dr. Rachel Morrison, my former student who'd asked those probing questions about balancing research with real-world impact during my first visit to Oxford. Rachel had graduated 2 years earlier with a doctorate in environmental engineering and a clear mission to implement carbon capture technology in developing nations. Her work in Bangladesh represented everything I'd hoped to accomplish through teaching: brilliant young scientists who could take foundational discoveries and transform them into solutions for the world's most vulnerable populations. The Oxford program had evolved beyond my wildest expectations. What started as an experimental collaboration between environmental science and policy departments had become a model replicated at universities across Europe and North America. Our graduates were working in government laboratories, environmental consulting firms, international development organizations, and startup companies focused on climate solutions. But the success had brought unexpected challenges. The program's reputation attracted students whose motivations weren't always aligned with its mission. Some were drawn by the prestige of studying under a Nobel laureate rather than genuine commitment to environmental work. Others saw climate research as a pathway to lucrative careers in consulting rather than meaningful contribution to global solutions. Navigating these dynamics required skills I'd never developed during my own research-focused career. I was learning to be a mentor, not just a scientist, helping students understand the difference between career advancement and life purpose. The lesson came into sharp focus during a conversation with Thomas, a brilliant second-year student whose research on atmospheric modeling was technically exceptional, but whose approach to the work felt purely transactional. "Dr. Martinez, I'm wondering about the publication timeline for my current project," he said during our weekly meeting. "I want to make sure I have enough high-impact papers for competitive postdoc applications." The question bothered me in ways I couldn't immediately articulate. Thomas was asking the right technical questions, but he seemed to view research as a series of career checkboxes rather than exploration driven by genuine curiosity or commitment to environmental solutions. "Tell me why this research matters to you personally," I said, setting aside the manuscript he'd submitted for review. "Well, atmospheric modeling is a growing field with good funding opportunities, and your program has an excellent reputation for placing graduates in top positions." His answer was perfectly logical and completely unsatisfying. I recognized something of my younger self in Thomas's focus on professional advancement, but I also saw what was missing: the passionate conviction that had driven me through years of failed experiments and personal sacrifice. "Thomas, let me ask you a different question. If you could solve any environmental problem, regardless of career implications, what would you choose to work on?" He looked genuinely puzzled by the question, as if the idea of choosing research topics based on personal passion rather than strategic career considerations had never occurred to him. The conversation forced me to reflect on what I was actually trying to accomplish through teaching. Technical training was important, but it wasn't sufficient. The world needed scientists who were motivated by more than professional success, researchers who could sustain decades of difficult work because they believed deeply in its importance. That realization led to the most significant innovation in our program: mandatory field experiences in communities directly affected by environmental challenges. Students couldn't graduate without spending at least one semester working on implementation projects in regions where climate change was already disrupting lives and livelihoods. The policy was controversial among faculty who worried about academic rigor, but the results were transformative. Students returned from field experiences with completely different perspectives on the urgency and human dimensions of environmental research. Thomas, who spent a semester working on water purification systems in coastal Kenya, returned to Oxford as a changed person. His research questions became more sophisticated, his motivation more genuine, and his sense of responsibility to affected communities more profound. "Dr. Martinez, I finally understand what you were trying to tell me," he said during our first meeting after his return. "The research isn't about publications or career advancement. It's about the fact that people are suffering right now because we haven't solved these problems yet." Watching students undergo this transformation reminded me why I'd chosen teaching over unlimited research funding. Individual discoveries matter, but training scientists who understand their broader responsibilities could multiply impact across generations. The personal satisfaction of mentoring was complicated by ongoing challenges in my own life. At 35, I was professionally fulfilled but personally isolated in ways that were becoming harder to ignore. The demands of running a program, conducting research, and maintaining an international reputation left little time for developing meaningful relationships outside academia. The few romantic connections I'd attempted since moving to Oxford had followed predictable patterns. Either people were intimidated by my professional achievements, or they were attracted to the Nobel Prize rather than to me as a person. The result was a series of brief relationships that felt more like public relations exercises than genuine emotional connections. Dr. Sarah Chen, now a close friend despite our geographic distance, had become my primary confidant about the challenges of building personal relationships while maintaining a high-profile scientific career. "Elena, you need to stop dating people who are impressed by your achievements," she said during one of our video calls. "Find someone who's accomplished enough in their own field that your Nobel Prize is just an interesting biographical detail." Her advice was sound but difficult to implement. Where exactly does a Nobel laureate meet people who are successful enough to relate as equals, but not so focused on their own careers that they can't build meaningful relationships? The answer came from an unexpected source, a conference on science communication that I'd been invited to keynote in Edinburgh. The event brought together researchers, journalists, and policymakers who were working on translating complex scientific discoveries into public understanding and political action. During the networking reception, I found myself in conversation with Dr. James Sullivan, an investigative journalist who specialized in covering environmental policy. He'd written extensively about carbon capture implementation, but our conversation quickly moved beyond professional topics to broader questions about the role of science in society. "What bothers me most about science journalism," he said over dinner after the conference sessions ended, "is how often we treat research as abstract intellectual exercise rather than urgent work that affects real people's lives." His perspective resonated with my own evolution from pure researcher to educator, focused on training scientists who understood their broader responsibilities. But what struck me most was how naturally our conversation flowed between professional insights and personal reflections. James was accomplished enough in his own field that my scientific achievements were interesting but not intimidating. He'd won major journalism awards for environmental reporting, covered climate negotiations for international publications, and written books that influenced public understanding of environmental policy. Our professional worlds overlapped without competing. More importantly, he seemed genuinely interested in me as a person rather than as a Nobel laureate. He asked about my teaching philosophy, my thoughts on work-life balance, my experiences growing up in a family where education was valued but scientific careers were unfamiliar territory. The relationship developed slowly over months of transatlantic conversations, professional collaborations on articles about climate science communication, and occasional visits when our travel schedules aligned. For the first time since Marcus, I was involved with someone who understood both the importance of my work and the personal costs of complete professional dedication. "You know what I find attractive about you?" James said during one of his visits to Oxford. "It's not the Nobel Prize or the carbon capture research, though those are impressive. It's the fact that you've figured out how to build a life around work that actually matters." His words highlighted something I'd been too busy to recognize. I had built a complete life, just not the conventional one that Marcus had wanted us to share. My work wasn't separate from my identity. It was the foundation for relationships, friendships, and daily routines that felt meaningful and sustainable. The Oxford program continued to expand and evolve. We'd graduated nearly 200 students who were working on environmental solutions around the world. Carbon capture facilities based on my original research were operating on 6 continents. The atmospheric carbon dioxide levels that had been rising steadily since the Industrial Revolution were finally beginning to decline. But perhaps the most satisfying development was watching former students become leaders in their own right. Rachel's work in Bangladesh had inspired similar projects across Southeast Asia. David, the student who'd asked about renewable energy storage, had founded a company that was revolutionizing grid-scale battery technology. Thomas had become one of the world's leading experts on atmospheric modeling for climate intervention strategies. Each success felt like vindication, not just of the original carbon capture research, but of the decision to focus on training the next generation rather than pursuing unlimited individual research funding. The 10-year anniversary of my Nobel Prize was marked by a symposium at Oxford featuring presentations from dozens of former students who were continuing to advance environmental science and policy. As I listened to their presentations, I realized that my most important contribution hadn't been the carbon capture discovery itself, but the institutional framework for training scientists who could continue expanding and implementing solutions for decades to come. During the anniversary dinner, I was approached by Dr. Emily Foster, a recent graduate who was working on ocean acidification reversal in Australia. "Dr. Martinez, I wanted to thank you for something specific," she said. "It's not just the technical training or the research opportunities. It's the way you taught us to think about science as a form of service rather than just intellectual achievement." Her words captured something I'd been trying to articulate about the evolution of my own career. The Nobel Prize had been recognition for individual discovery, but the work that felt most meaningful now was collective, building systems that would continue generating solutions long after any individual researcher was gone. That evening, as James and I walked through Oxford's ancient streets discussing the day's presentations, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The woman who'd chosen science over a conventional relationship with Marcus had built something far more complex and satisfying than either alternative she'd imagined at the time. Professional achievement had been important, but it was only part of a life that now included meaningful relationships, intellectual community, and daily work that contributed to solutions for humanity's greatest challenges. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you'd made different choices?" James asked as we paused by the college gates. I considered the question seriously. What if I'd prioritized my relationship with Marcus over carbon capture research? What if I'd taken the Foundation's offer of unlimited individual research funding instead of committing to teaching? What if I'd focused purely on personal happiness rather than professional achievement? "I don't think I'd change anything," I said finally. The choices that seemed like sacrifices at the time turned out to be investments in exactly the life I wanted to build. Marcus had predicted I'd never find anyone better than him, but he'd defined better in conventional terms. Someone who would prioritize our relationship over everything else, someone who would choose personal happiness over professional ambition, someone who would build a life around traditional markers of success rather than contribution to larger causes. He'd been completely wrong, but not in the way I'd expected when I first achieved recognition for the carbon capture work. I hadn't found someone better in the sense of more successful or more attractive or more compatible. I'd found something better, a way of living that integrated personal fulfillment with meaningful work, relationships that enhanced rather than competed with professional purpose, and the satisfaction of knowing that my choices had contributed to solutions for problems that affected millions of people. Standing outside the Oxford College where I'd spent the past 5 years training the next generation of environmental scientists, surrounded by the institutional legacy of centuries of learning and discovery, I felt something I'd never experienced during the lonely years of graduate school, or the isolated period following my Nobel Prize, complete alignment between who I was and what I was doing with my life. The carbon capture research had been the beginning, not the end. The Nobel Prize had been recognized, but not the ultimate goal. The real achievement was building a life around work that would continue long after I was gone, training scientists who would continue pushing the boundaries of what was possible, and contributing to solutions that would benefit generations of people who would never know my name. Marcus had been wrong about my prospects for finding someone better, but more importantly, he'd been wrong about what kind of life was worth building. I'd found something better than any individual relationship, a complete life constructed around purpose, community, and the deep satisfaction of knowing that my choices mattered for the future of the world. 15 years after winning the Nobel Prize, I received an invitation that brought everything full circle in the most unexpected way. Northwestern University, where my journey had begun in that cramped graduate lab, was establishing the Elena Martinez Center for Environmental Solutions. They wanted me to deliver the keynote address at the dedication ceremony. Standing in the same lecture hall where I'd attended graduate seminars as a struggling doctoral student, now as the featured speaker at an event honoring my contributions to science, felt like stepping through a portal between different versions of my life. The auditorium was packed with current students, faculty members, government officials, and environmental advocates who'd gathered to celebrate the center's launch. But the person I noticed most in the audience was sitting in the third row, Marcus. He was older now, obviously, with gray threading through his blonde hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of 15 years of experience I knew nothing about. But his presence in that room felt like an echo from a previous lifetime, a reminder of choices made and paths not taken. During the reception following my speech, he approached me with the cautious demeanor of someone unsure of their welcome. Elena, congratulations on everything you've accomplished. This center is an incredible honor. Thank you for coming, I said, genuinely surprised by how neutral I felt seeing him again. I didn't expect to see you here. I've been following your work over the years, the carbon capture technology, the teaching program at Oxford, the policy advisory work. It's exactly what you said you wanted to do all those years ago. There was something in his tone that suggested regret, though I couldn't tell whether he regretted our breakup or simply the harsh words he'd spoken during it. How have you been? I asked, curious despite myself about the life he'd built after our relationship ended. Good. Married now, 2 kids. Still in marketing, though I moved into environmental consulting after your research started making headlines. It seemed like the right transition. The irony was notable. Marcus had found his way into environmental work, at least tangentially, after dismissing my passion for it as obsessive and unrealistic, but I felt no satisfaction in pointing that out. Too much time had passed, and I'd moved too far beyond needing validation from him. I'm glad you found something that feels meaningful, I said, and meant it. Elena, I owe you an apology for the things I said when we broke up. I was wrong about your potential, obviously, but I was also wrong about what kind of life was worth building. You proved that following your passion, even at great personal cost, can lead to something extraordinary. His words were generous, but they highlighted a fundamental misunderstanding that had persisted even after all these years. My life hadn't involved great personal cost, it had involved choosing a different definition of personal fulfillment than the one he'd wanted us to share. I didn't sacrifice anything, Marcus. I chose differently. There's a distinction. Before he could respond, James appeared at my side, having navigated through the crowd of reception attendees to find me. Elena, there's a producer from the BBC here who wants to discuss the documentary project, he said, then noticed Marcus and extended his hand politely. I'm James Sullivan. Marcus Chen, he replied, shaking James's hand while clearly trying to place him in the context of my life. James is my partner, I explained simply. He's an environmental journalist who's covered the carbon capture implementation extensively. The brief interaction was perfectly cordial, but I could see Marcus processing the information, perhaps comparing James to himself and wondering about the dynamics of a relationship between 2 people whose careers were aligned around shared values. After Marcus excused himself to rejoin his wife across the room, James and I stepped onto the terrace overlooking the Northwestern campus where I'd spent so many formative years. Old boyfriend? James asked without jealousy, just curiosity. The one who said I'd never find anyone better than him. James was quiet for a moment, looking out at the university buildings where some of the world's most important environmental research was now happening. Did you find someone better? He asked with a slight smile. The question was playful, but it touched on something I'd been thinking about throughout the evening. Had I found someone better than Marcus? The comparison felt irrelevant now, like asking whether a symphony was better than a photograph. They were completely different categories of experience. I found something different, I said. Something that fits the life I actually wanted to build. The documentary project James had mentioned was part of a broader media initiative around the 20th anniversary of the original Nature publication that had launched my career. Multiple production companies were developing projects about the carbon capture breakthrough and its global implementation. But the BBC proposal was unique. They wanted to focus on the human story behind the science, the personal journey from graduate student to Nobel laureate to educator and policy advisor. We're particularly interested in exploring how personal choices intersect with scientific achievement, explained Sarah Thompson, the documentary's director, during our meeting the following week. Your story represents something important about the relationship between individual ambition and collective benefit. The filming process, which took place over several months, forced me to revisit aspects of my journey that I'd largely stopped thinking about. The producers interviewed former colleagues, students, policymakers who'd worked on carbon capture implementation, and family members who'd supported me through various stages of the career. But the most revealing interview was with Dr. Patterson, my graduate advisor, who was now in her 70s and recently retired from Northwestern. Elena was always brilliant, she told the camera crew in her emeritus office. But what made her exceptional was her persistence in the face of failure. Most graduate students would have given up after the first dozen failed experiments. Elena treated each failure as information that brought her closer to success. Watching the preliminary cut of the documentary months later, I was struck by how different my story looked from the outside. The narrative arc from struggling graduate student to Nobel laureate appeared almost inevitable in retrospect, as if each setback had been a necessary step toward ultimate triumph. But that wasn't how it had felt while living through it. The uncertainty, the isolation, the constant doubt about whether my research would lead anywhere meaningful, none of that came through in the polished documentary narrative. The missing element was what I'd come to understand as the most important part of the journey, the daily choice to continue working on something I believed mattered, even when there was no guarantee of success or recognition. That realization influenced the final project I decided to undertake before considering retirement, a memoir that would capture not just the achievements, but the internal experience of choosing purpose over conventional security. Too many scientific autobiographies focus on the discoveries, I explained to my editor during our first meeting. I want to write about the decision-making process, the way small choices compound over time to create a life you never explicitly planned. The writing process was more emotionally challenging than I'd expected. Revisiting the loneliness of graduate school, the pain of losing Marcus, the isolation that followed early success, all of it required a level of introspection that felt uncomfortable for someone trained to focus on external, measurable outcomes. But it also provided clarity about the trajectory that had brought me to this point in my life. The woman who'd cried in that Chicago apartment while her boyfriend predicted her failure had made a series of choices that seemed risky or even destructive at the time, but had ultimately created exactly the life she wanted to live. The memoir was published 2 years later, coinciding with the 25th anniversary of the original carbon capture research. The book tour took me to universities, research institutions, and conferences around the world, where I spoke to audiences of young scientists who were facing their own versions of the choices I'd made decades earlier. The question I heard most frequently was, how do you know when a professional sacrifice is worth making? It was the wrong question, but I understood why people asked it. The narrative of my life, as presented in media coverage and public speaking events, suggested a trade-off between personal happiness and professional achievement. Choose your career over relationships, work harder than everyone else, accept isolation as the price of success. But that wasn't the actual lesson of my experience. The question isn't whether sacrifice is worth it, I would tell audiences. The question is whether you're choosing a life that aligns with your deepest values and interests. If you are, the things you give up won't feel like sacrifices, they'll feel like investments in becoming who you want to be. During one university visit, a graduate student asked the question that captured the complexity of these choices most directly. Dr. Martinez, do you think you would have been happier if you'd chosen differently, if you'd prioritized your relationship with Marcus over your research? I considered the question seriously before answering, as I always did when students asked about the personal dimensions of career choices. Happiness is complicated, I said finally. If I'd stayed with Marcus, I might have had a different kind of contentment, the satisfaction of a stable relationship, conventional milestones, a more predictable life, but I don't think I would have been fulfilled in the way that I am now. What's the difference? Another student asked. Happiness can be passive. It can come from circumstances aligning with your preferences. Fulfillment requires active engagement with something you find meaningful. I get up every morning excited about the work I'm doing, the students I'm teaching, the problems I'm trying to solve. That's worth more than any relationship that would have required me to be someone other than who I am. The memoir tour also brought unexpected personal developments. At a climate science conference in Geneva, I was approached by Dr. Lisa Wang, a former student who'd graduated from our Oxford program nearly a decade earlier. Dr. Martinez, I wanted to thank you for something specific, she said during the conference reception. When I was your student, you taught me that the best career decisions are made by asking what kind of person you want to become, not what kind of life you want to have. That advice changed everything for me. Lisa had gone on to lead atmospheric research for the United Nations, developing global standards for carbon capture implementation that were based on my original discoveries, but had evolved far beyond anything I'd imagined possible. Your research gave us the tools, she continued, but your teaching gave us the framework for using those tools responsibly. That's the real legacy of your work. Her words highlighted something I'd come to understand about the relationship between individual achievement and collective impact. The carbon capture breakthrough had been important, but training scientists who could expand and responsibly implement solutions was perhaps more significant than any single discovery. As I approached my 60th birthday, I began seriously considering the question of legacy. The research center at Northwestern was training the next generation of environmental scientists. Carbon capture facilities were operating on every continent, processing atmospheric carbon dioxide at scales that were beginning to reverse decades of environmental damage. Former students were leading research institutions, government agencies, and private companies focused on climate solutions. But the measurement of impact that felt most meaningful was personal. I had built a life around work that mattered, relationships that enhanced rather than constrained my purpose, and daily routines that felt aligned with my deepest values. The last conversation I had with Marcus was at our Northwestern reunion, 5 years after the research center dedication. He approached me during the alumni reception, now completely gray-haired but still recognizable as the man who'd once shared my apartment and predicted my failure. "Elena, I've been thinking about our conversation since the last time we met," he said. "You said you didn't sacrifice anything, that you chose differently. I think I finally understand what you meant." "Oh, I built the life I thought I was supposed to want. Marriage, kids, financial security, conventional success. It's been good, but it's also been predictable. You built the life you actually wanted, even when it looked risky or unconventional. That takes a different kind of courage." His words were generous, but they also revealed the persistent misunderstanding that had defined our different approaches to life. I hadn't been courageous in choosing research over relationships. I'd simply been honest about what kind of person I was, and what kind of life would make me feel most alive. "I hope you found what you were looking for," I said sincerely. "I have, mostly, and I hope you realize how extraordinary what you've built really is." As the reunion ended, and James and I prepared to return to Oxford, I found myself reflecting on the strange circularity of life. Standing in the same buildings where I'd first learned to think like a scientist, now as someone whose work had influenced global environmental policy, felt like completing a circuit that had been decades in the making. But the most satisfying realization was how completely I'd moved beyond needing validation from anyone who'd once doubted my potential. Marcus's approval, while kind, was irrelevant to my sense of self-worth. I'd built something that mattered not because it proved him wrong, but because it aligned with everything I'd always believed was possible when someone committed themselves completely to work they found meaningful. The woman who'd been told she'd never find anyone better had found something infinitely more valuable, a complete life constructed around purpose, community, and the deep satisfaction of knowing that her choices had contributed to solutions for humanity's greatest challenges. Looking back, I realized that Marcus had been right about one thing. I never did find anyone better than him, in the conventional sense he'd meant, but I'd found something better than what he'd offered. A life that felt true to who I actually was, rather than who someone else thought I should become. The years following the memoir's publication brought unexpected developments that added new dimensions to what I'd thought was a completed story. The book had resonated with readers far beyond the scientific community, particularly with young women who were struggling to balance ambitious career goals with societal expectations about relationships and family. Universities across the globe began inviting me to deliver commencement addresses, viewing my journey as emblematic of what was possible when someone refused to accept limitations imposed by others' narrow definitions of success. These speaking engagements took me to campuses in India, Brazil, South Africa, and dozens of other countries where young scientists were working on their own versions of world-changing research. The most memorable commencement speech was at my alma mater's rival university, where I addressed a graduating class that included several students whose research had been directly inspired by the carbon capture breakthrough. Standing at the podium, looking out at thousands of graduates who would soon begin their own professional journeys, I felt the weight of representing possibilities they might not yet imagine for themselves. 25 years ago, I was sitting where you are now, I told them, believing that my only options were conventional success or personal failure. It took me years to understand that there was a third path, defining success according to your own values rather than society's expectations. The responses to these speeches often came months later, in letters and emails from graduates who'd taken risks they wouldn't have considered otherwise. A young engineer in Mumbai wrote about starting a nonprofit focused on bringing clean water technology to rural communities. A chemistry graduate from São Paulo described leaving a lucrative pharmaceutical job to pursue research on biodegradable plastics. Each message reinforced my growing understanding that carbon capture research had become a catalyst for something larger than environmental science. It had become a symbol of what was possible when someone committed themselves to work they believed could make a meaningful difference, regardless of personal costs or external skepticism. This unexpected influence led to an invitation that surprised even me. The Secretary General of the United Nations asked me to serve as a special advisor on scientific innovation for sustainable development. The position would involve traveling to developing nations, consulting with local researchers, and helping to identify scientific solutions that could be implemented at scale in resource-constrained environments. Martinez, your background combines pure research excellence with practical implementation experience, explained Undersecretary Maria Santos during our video interview. We need someone who understands both the technical challenges of developing solutions and the policy complexities of implementing them globally. Accepting the UN position meant restructuring my life once again. James and I had built a comfortable routine between Oxford and his journalism assignments, but the UN work would require extensive travel to regions where his reporting rarely took him. We faced the same fundamental question that had ended my relationship with Marcus decades earlier. Could we build a partnership around two demanding careers that didn't always align geographically? The difference was that James understood my work wasn't just a career choice, but a fundamental part of who I was. Rather than seeing the UN position as competition for my attention, he viewed it as a natural extension of the values that had brought us together. Elena, this is exactly the kind of opportunity you were meant to pursue, he said when I expressed concerns about the travel demands. We'll figure out the logistics. What matters is that you're being asked to use your experience to help solve problems for people who need these solutions most. The UN assignment took me to communities where environmental challenges weren't abstract policy debates but immediate threats to survival. In Bangladesh, I worked with local scientists who were adapting carbon capture technology for regions regularly flooded by rising sea levels. In Kenya, I consulted with researchers developing drought-resistant agriculture techniques based on principles similar to those I'd used for atmospheric carbon processing. These experiences profoundly changed my understanding of what scientific responsibility meant. The laboratory discoveries that had made my career were only valuable if they could be implemented in ways that actually improved lives for people facing environmental crises right now. The most transformative project was in the Philippines, where a team of young scientists had developed modifications to my original carbon capture bacteria that could process atmospheric carbon while simultaneously improving soil quality for agricultural use. Their innovation represented exactly the kind of practical adaptation that could address multiple environmental challenges simultaneously. Dr. Martinez, your research gave us the foundation, explained Dr. Rosa Mendoza, the project's lead scientist, but we had to modify everything to work with local conditions, available materials, and community needs. That's the real challenge of environmental science, making laboratory discoveries work in the real world. Her words highlighted something I'd been learning throughout the UN assignment. The most important scientific work often happened not in prestigious research institutions, but in resource-constrained environments, where researchers had to be incredibly creative about implementation. This realization influenced the final major project of my career, establishing an international network of research collaboratives focused specifically on adapting environmental technologies for developing regions, rather than the traditional model of innovations flowing from wealthy institutions to poorer communities. This network would support local scientists in developing solutions tailored to their specific environmental and economic conditions. The initiative, funded through a combination of UN resources, private foundations, and government partnerships, represented everything I'd learned about the relationship between scientific discovery and real-world impact. Pure research was essential, but it was only the beginning of a process that required local knowledge, community engagement, and sustained implementation support. 5 years into the UN assignment, as I was preparing to transition from active consulting to an advisory role, I received news that brought my story full circle in the most unexpected way. The Nobel Committee announced that the Peace Prize was being awarded to the International Carbon Capture Consortium, the global network of researchers, policymakers, and implementation specialists who had turned my original discovery into a worldwide climate solution. As one of the consortium's founding members, I was invited to the ceremony in Oslo, where I watched representatives from dozens of countries accept recognition for collaborative work that had measurably slowed global warming while providing economic opportunities for communities worldwide. Sitting in the audience during the Peace Prize ceremony, I thought about the young graduate student who'd once believed her only choice was between personal happiness and professional achievement. She couldn't have imagined that her research would eventually contribute to international peace efforts by providing tools for addressing environmental conflicts that threatened global stability. The Peace Prize ceremony was attended by many of my former students, now leading researchers and policymakers in their own right. During the reception, I found myself surrounded by people whose careers had been shaped by the educational programs we'd developed at Oxford, who were continuing to expand and refine solutions for environmental challenges I'd never even considered. Dr. Martinez, I wanted to thank you for teaching us that science is ultimately about service, said Dr. Amy Chen, who now directed environmental research for the European Union. That perspective has guided every career decision I've made since graduating from your program. The gathering felt like a celebration not just of the carbon capture technology's global impact, but of an entire generation of scientists who'd been trained to think about research as a tool for addressing humanity's greatest challenges. These were researchers who understood that technical excellence was only meaningful if it contributed to solutions that could be implemented equitably and sustainably. As the evening progressed, I realized that my most significant contribution hadn't been the original discovery but the institutional framework for training scientists who could continue expanding and improving environmental solutions for decades to come. The carbon capture breakthrough had been important, but building educational programs that produced ethically committed researchers might prove more valuable in the long term. The final validation of this approach came during my last major public appearance before retiring from active UN work. Speaking at a global climate summit in Geneva, I was introduced not as a Nobel laureate or discoverer of carbon capture technology, but as someone who had fundamentally changed how we think about the relationship between scientific research and social responsibility. Standing at that podium, looking out at an audience of researchers, policymakers, and activists from around the world, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal recognition. These were people who were continuing work that would matter long after any individual scientist was forgotten, solving problems that affected billions of people, pursuing research guided by values that put collective benefit ahead of individual advancement. The woman who'd been told she'd never find anyone better than her ex-boyfriend had built something that transcended any personal relationship, a global community of scientists committed to using their skills for the benefit of humanity. That felt like the best possible response to anyone who'd ever doubted what was possible when someone chose purpose over convention, dedication over comfort, and the future of the world over the approval of people who couldn't understand their vision. Marcus had been wrong in ways he never could have imagined. I hadn't just found someone better. I'd found something better than he'd ever offered. A life that contributed to solutions for humanity's greatest challenges, relationships that enhanced rather than constrained my work, and the satisfaction of knowing that my choices had helped create a better world for generations to come. The retirement transition came gradually, as I stepped back from daily administrative responsibilities while maintaining advisory roles with key institutions. James and I finally had the opportunity to build the kind of consistent domestic life that had been impossible during our years of constant travel and professional demands. We settled into a renovated farmhouse outside Oxford where I could maintain a small private laboratory while James worked on his environmental journalism projects. The adjustment to a quieter pace was more difficult than I'd anticipated. After decades of 18-hour workdays and international travel, the rhythm of domestic life felt almost foreign. I found myself restless during long summer afternoons, accustomed to the constant urgency of research deadlines and policy consultations. The solution came from an unexpected source: my great-niece Sophia, Carmen's granddaughter, who was 8 years old and endlessly curious about everything from why leaves change color to how airplanes stayed in the sky. During family visits, she would pepper me with questions that required me to explain complex scientific concepts in terms a child could understand. "Aunt Elena, why can't we just suck all the bad air out of the sky?" she asked during one memorable afternoon in my garden. Her question was essentially what I'd spent my career working on, but explaining carbon capture to an 8-year-old required stripping away decades of technical jargon to focus on fundamental principles. The exercise was more intellectually challenging than many of the policy consultations I'd conducted with world leaders. Those conversations with Sophia inspired my final project, a series of children's books about environmental science that would introduce young readers to complex concepts through stories and illustrations. The idea was to plant seeds of scientific curiosity in children who might grow up to continue the work of solving environmental challenges. Working with illustrators and children's book editors was completely different from any collaboration I'd experienced in academic or policy work. Everything had to be simplified without being dumbed down, engaging without being inaccurate, inspiring without being preachy. The first book, Sophia and the Carbon-Eating Bacteria, told the story of a young girl who discovers that tiny organisms can help clean the air. The second, The Great Ocean Cleanup, introduced concepts about marine environmental restoration. Each book included activities and experiments that children could safely conduct at home with their families. The publishing process was surprisingly rewarding. Unlike academic publications that reached narrow specialist audiences, these books would potentially influence thousands of children during their formative years. Parents wrote letters describing how their children had become interested in science after reading the stories, how family conversations had shifted to include environmental topics, and how young readers were asking questions about careers in environmental research. One letter particularly moved me. A mother in Detroit wrote that her 10-year-old daughter had announced her intention to become an environmental scientist like Dr. Martinez after reading the bacteria book. The girl had started a composting project in their backyard and was teaching her classmates about carbon cycles during show-and-tell presentations. "Dr. Martinez, you've given my daughter a vision of what's possible for her future," the mother wrote. She sees science not as something abstract that happens in distant laboratories, but as work that can make a real difference in the world. The children's book series led to another unexpected opportunity: consultation on science curricula for elementary schools. Educational administrators had noticed that traditional approaches to science education often failed to engage students who didn't see themselves represented in scientific careers or who couldn't connect classroom learning to real-world applications. Working with curriculum developers, I helped design programs that introduced environmental science concepts through hands-on projects, community connections, and stories about diverse scientists working on climate solutions. The goal was to help children understand that science was something they could participate in, not just observe from a distance. The pilot programs were implemented in schools across 3 continents, with remarkable results. Student engagement in science classes increased significantly, particularly among girls and students from underrepresented communities who had previously shown little interest in scientific subjects. "Dr. Martinez, you've helped us understand that science education isn't just about teaching facts," explained Dr. Janet Williams, a curriculum specialist from Toronto. "It's about helping students see themselves as potential problem solvers who can contribute to solutions for challenges they care about." The educational work connected me with a community of teachers, administrators, and child development experts who were approaching scientific literacy from completely different angles than my previous research collaborations. Their insights about how children learn and develop interests challenged me to think more creatively about science communication and public engagement. This led to my involvement with the Global Science Education Initiative, an international effort to redesign science curricula around problem-solving and real-world applications rather than memorization and abstract concepts. The initiative brought together educators, researchers, and policymakers who were working to ensure that the next generation would be better prepared to address environmental challenges than previous generations had been. The most ambitious component of the initiative was establishing residential summer programs where middle school students could spend 2 weeks working directly with practicing scientists on simplified versions of current research projects. These weren't science camps in the traditional sense, but intensive experiences that gave young people authentic exposure to how scientific research actually worked. I volunteered to host one of these programs at Oxford, bringing 12 students from around the world to work on basic atmospheric chemistry experiments in the same laboratories where I'd trained graduate students. Watching 13-year-olds conduct their first successful enzyme synthesis reactions reminded me why I'd fallen in love with research in the first place. "Dr. Martinez, is this really how you discovered the carbon capture bacteria?" asked Emma, a student from rural Wales whose enthusiasm for chemistry had impressed her teachers despite her school's limited laboratory resources. "The principles are the same," I told her as she examined her experimental results. "What you're doing right now, observing, hypothesizing, testing, analyzing, that's exactly the process that led to every major scientific discovery." Emma's question crystallized something I'd been thinking about throughout the educational work: the gap between how science is practiced and how it's typically taught. Most students learned about scientific discoveries as historical facts, rather than as examples of ongoing processes they could participate in themselves. The summer program model proved so successful that it was expanded to dozens of universities worldwide, creating opportunities for thousands of young people to experience authentic scientific research before making decisions about their academic and career paths. 5 years after establishing the program, I began receiving letters from former participants who were now in universities studying environmental science, engineering, medicine, and other fields. Many credited their summer research experience with helping them understand that science was something they could pursue professionally, not just admire from a distance. One particularly gratifying letter came from Miguel, a student from rural Mexico who had participated in the atmospheric chemistry program when he was 14. He was now completing his doctorate in environmental engineering at MIT, working on scaled applications of carbon capture technology for developing regions. Martinez. That summer at Oxford changed my entire understanding of what was possible for my future, he wrote. Seeing research as something I could actually do, rather than something that only happened in movies or distant laboratories, gave me the confidence to pursue scientific education even when people in my community didn't understand why I was interested in environmental issues. Reading Miguel's letter in my Oxford garden, surrounded by the flowers and vegetables that James and I had planted together, I felt a deep satisfaction that was different from any professional recognition I'd received. The Nobel Prize had validated my individual research achievements, but seeing young people pursue scientific careers because of educational programs I'd helped develop felt like a more meaningful legacy. The educational work also brought unexpected personal revelations. Spending time with children and adolescents who were just beginning to explore their interests and capabilities reminded me of my own journey from curious child to practicing scientist. I began to see my career not as a series of individual achievements, but as part of a longer chain of mentorship and knowledge transfer that connected generations of researchers. This perspective influenced the memoir's second edition, which included new chapters about the educational initiatives and reflections on the relationship between individual achievement and collective progress. The revised book emphasized that scientific breakthroughs were always built on foundations laid by previous researchers and were only valuable if they could be transmitted to future generations. The second edition's reception was even more enthusiastic than the original, particularly among educators and parents, who appreciated the focus on nurturing scientific curiosity in young people. Book tour events now included school visits, teacher workshops, and family science festivals that introduced environmental concepts to audiences who might never have attended traditional academic lectures. During one school visit in Phoenix, a 7-year-old named David raised his hand during my presentation and asked, "Dr. Martinez, do you think kids like me can really help save the planet?" His question, asked with the complete seriousness that only children can bring to fundamental issues, reminded me why the educational work mattered as much as the original research. Environmental challenges would require solutions from the next generation, not just from my generation of scientists. "David, I don't just think you can help save the planet," I told him, and the auditorium was full of children. "I'm counting on you to do it. The tools we've developed are just the beginning. You and your classmates are going to discover solutions we haven't even imagined yet." The light in his eyes when I said that, the sudden understanding that he could be part of something important, that his curiosity and intelligence could contribute to solving real problems, justified every hour I'd spent on educational initiatives instead of pursuing additional research projects. As I approached my 70th birthday, looking back on a career that had evolved from individual research to global policy work to educational advocacy, I realized that Marcus's prediction about my future had been wrong in the most fundamental way possible. He'd thought I was choosing between personal fulfillment and professional achievement, between relationships and recognition, between happiness and success, but those had been false choices based on his narrow understanding of what a complete life could include. What I'd actually built was a life where personal fulfillment came from professional work that contributed to collective benefit, where the most meaningful relationships were based on shared values rather than conventional expectations, where happiness emerged from the knowledge that my choices had helped create opportunities for others to continue solving humanity's greatest challenges. The woman who'd been told she'd never find anyone better had found something infinitely more valuable, a way of living that would continue to generate positive impact long after she was gone, through the scientists she'd trained, the policies she'd influenced, the technologies she'd developed, and the children she'd inspired to pursue their own versions of world-changing work. The most unexpected chapter of my story began when I turned 75, James and I had settled into what we assumed would be our final routine: quiet mornings in the garden, afternoons dedicated to writing and correspondence, evenings spent hosting dinner parties for the rotating cast of former students and colleagues who visited Oxford. It was a peaceful existence, intellectually stimulating but physically manageable. Then came the phone call that changed everything once again. Dr. Martinez, this is Administrator Chen from the Mars Colonial Research Initiative, said the voice on the other end of the line. We have an unusual proposal for you. The Mars project had been gaining momentum for several years, as private space companies and international government partnerships worked toward establishing the first permanent human settlement on another planet. The environmental technologies developed for Earth's climate crisis were proving essential for creating sustainable life support systems in space. Our atmospheric processing systems are based on modifications of your original carbon capture research, Administrator Chen explained. But we're facing challenges that require someone with your specific expertise in both the technical aspects and the broader implementation strategies. The offer was extraordinary. Serve as senior consultant for the atmospheric engineering team that would design Mars's artificial atmosphere. The position would involve 6 months of intensive collaboration with the world's leading aerospace engineers, atmospheric physicists, and planetary scientists. At 75, most people would have politely declined such a demanding opportunity. But the chance to see my research adapted for humanity's next great adventure felt like the perfect capstone to a career dedicated to solving seemingly impossible problems. I'll need to discuss this with my husband, I told Administrator Chen, but I'm very interested. James's reaction was everything I could have hoped for. Instead of expressing concern about the physical demands or travel requirements, his first question was about the scientific possibilities. Elena, do you realize what this means? Your work won't just help save Earth, it could make human life possible on other planets. How could you not pursue that opportunity? The Mars consultation required relocating to the Johnson Space Center in Houston for 6 months, working alongside teams that included some of the most innovative scientists and engineers in the world. The technical challenges were unlike anything I'd encountered, creating atmospheric processing systems that could function in Mars's low gravity, extreme temperature variations, and radiation environment. But the fundamental principles were extensions of concepts I'd been developing for decades. The carbon capture bacteria that had launched my career provided the foundation for biological systems that could process Martian atmospheric gases while producing oxygen for human habitation. Dr. Martinez, your background is unique, explained Dr. Sarah Kim, the project's lead atmospheric engineer. Most specialists understand either the biological aspects or the engineering requirements, but not both. You've spent your career thinking about how biological solutions can be implemented at planetary scales. Working with the Mars team introduced me to scientific problems I'd never imagined. How do you design biological systems that can survive radiation exposure that would be lethal to Earth organisms? How do you create atmospheric processing that can function during massive dust storms that last for months? How do you ensure that human settlements can maintain life support systems without constant resupply from Earth? The solutions required combining principles from atmospheric chemistry, synthetic biology, engineering systems design, and space physics. It was the most intellectually challenging work I'd undertaken since graduate school, but with the advantage of decades of experience in translating laboratory discoveries into real-world applications. The breakthrough came during my 4th month at Johnson Space Center. Working with a team of synthetic biologists, we developed genetically modified organisms that could process Martian atmospheric components while thriving in low-pressure, high-radiation environments. These organisms could potentially transform Mars's thin carbon dioxide atmosphere into breathable air for human settlers. Dr. Martinez, this could revolutionize space colonization, said Dr. Michael Torres, the project's chief scientist, after reviewing our experimental results. We're not just talking about life support systems anymore. We're talking about terraforming capabilities. The implications were staggering. The research that had begun as a graduate student's attempt to address Earth's climate crisis had evolved into technology that could make human life sustainable throughout the solar system. But the Mars project also forced me to confront ethical questions I'd never seriously considered. Should humans be colonizing other planets while Earth's environmental problems remain unsolved? What responsibilities did we have to potential Martian ecosystems? How could we ensure that space colonization benefited all of humanity rather than just wealthy nations and corporations? These questions led to the most intense ethical discussions of my career. The Mars team included philosophers, ethicists, and social scientists alongside the engineers and physical scientists. Our weekly seminars addressed not just technical feasibility, but the moral implications of using my atmospheric processing technology to establish human presence on another planet. Dr. Martinez, your research has given us capabilities that previous generations could only imagine, said Dr. Lisa Patel, the project's ethics advisor. But with those capabilities comes unprecedented responsibility for how they're used. The ethical frameworks we developed became as important as the technical specifications. The Mars Colonial Initiative committed to sharing atmospheric processing technologies with all Earth nations, ensuring that space colonization advances would also benefit terrestrial environmental restoration efforts. When my 6-month consultation ended, I returned to Oxford with a completely new perspective on the long-term implications of environmental science. The carbon capture research that had consumed my graduate school years was now contributing to humanity's expansion beyond Earth itself. The experience also reinforced my conviction that the most important scientific work happened at the intersection of multiple disciplines. Solving complex problems required not just technical expertise, but ethical reflection, policy analysis, and deep consideration of social implications. This insight influenced my final major writing project, a comprehensive analysis of how environmental technologies developed for Earth's climate crisis were enabling space exploration and colonization. The book, titled From Earth to Mars: How Climate Solutions Became Space Technologies, explored the unexpected connections between terrestrial environmental restoration and extraterrestrial settlement capabilities. The writing process required extensive research into aerospace engineering, planetary science, and space policy, fields I'd never studied formally but that had become relevant to understanding my own work's broader implications. It was intellectually demanding in ways that kept me engaged well into my 70s, proving that curiosity and learning capacity didn't have to diminish with age. The book's publication coincided with the successful launch of the first Mars atmospheric processing mission, which carried modified versions of carbon capture organisms to begin preliminary terraforming experiments. Watching the launch from Cape Kennedy, sitting beside James and surrounded by the engineers and scientists I'd worked with at Johnson Space Center, felt like witnessing the culmination of everything I'd worked toward. But the most meaningful moment came during the post-launch reception, when Dr. Kim approached me with tears in her eyes. Dr. Martinez, my 8-year-old daughter, watched the launch this morning and asked if she could become a scientist like you when she grows up. I told her that because of your work, by the time she's an adult, humans might be living on Mars. She said she wants to help design the cities they'll build there. Her words highlighted something I'd been thinking about throughout the Mars project: how scientific breakthroughs create possibilities that inspire the next generation to pursue even more ambitious goals. The work that had seemed impossibly challenging during my graduate school years was now the foundation for achievements that would have been pure science fiction when I was young. The Mars connection also led to unexpected late-career recognition. The International Astronautical Congress awarded me their highest honor for contributions to space exploration, making me the first environmental scientist to receive recognition typically reserved for aerospace engineers and astronauts. The award ceremony in Paris brought together space scientists, government officials, and private industry leaders who were working on various aspects of human space exploration. Being included in this community felt like joining a group dedicated to humanity's most ambitious long-term goals. During my acceptance speech, I reflected on the journey from struggling graduate student to space technology consultant. When I started researching carbon capture in a basement laboratory at Northwestern University, I never imagined that work would eventually contribute to making human life possible on other planets. This reminds us that we can't predict where scientific curiosity will lead, but we can be certain that persistent dedication to solving important problems will create opportunities we never anticipated. The space work also brought an unexpected personal development, reconciliation with aspects of my past that I thought I'd completely resolved. During one of my visits to Johnson Space Center, I encountered Dr. Rebecca Martinez, no relation, despite the shared surname, who had been Marcus's colleague at his current environmental consulting firm. Dr. Martinez, Marcus has followed your career extensively over the years, she mentioned during a break in our atmospheric processing meetings. He speaks often about how wrong he was about your potential and how much he's learned from watching your success. The conversation was brief and professional, but it prompted me to reflect on how completely my life had diverged from the path Marcus had envisioned for us. The woman he'd wanted me to become, someone who prioritized relationships over ambitious career goals, would never have developed the expertise that made space colonization possible. That realization led to one final gesture of closure. On my 76th birthday, I sent Marcus a brief message. I wanted you to know that the research you once dismissed as obsessive is now helping humanity prepare to live on other planets. Thank you for helping me understand early in my career that I needed to choose between conventional expectations and the possibility of contributing to humanity's greatest adventures. I chose correctly, and I hope you found peace with the life you built as well. His response came within hours. Elena, I've spent decades recognizing how profoundly I misunderstood what you were capable of achieving. Your work has become part of humanity's greatest story, and I'm grateful that my skepticism didn't prevent you from pursuing your vision. Congratulations on a life that has exceeded everyone's expectations, including probably your own. Reading Marcus's message in my Oxford garden, surrounded by the books, research notes, and photographs that documented a career spanning 7 decades, I felt complete closure with the choices that had defined my life. The woman who'd cried in that Chicago apartment while her boyfriend predicted her failure had built something that would influence human civilization for centuries to come. The Mars Project represented the final validation of a simple principle that had guided every major decision since graduate school. When you commit yourself completely to work that addresses humanity's greatest challenges, you create possibilities that seemed impossible when you started. As I prepared for my 80th birthday celebration, planned as a gathering of former students, colleagues, and family members who would come to Oxford from around the world, I reflected on the unexpected trajectory that had brought me to this moment. The carbon capture research had been just the beginning. Training the next generation of environmental scientists had multiplied the impact. The children's education initiatives had inspired a new generation of problem solvers. The Mars consultation had extended humanity's reach beyond Earth itself. But perhaps the most satisfying realization was that none of these achievements had required sacrificing my fundamental identity or values. I'd built a complete life around work that mattered, relationships that enhanced rather than constrained my purpose, and daily choices that contributed to solutions for problems larger than any individual concern. The birthday celebration would bring together people whose careers and lives had been influenced by the educational programs, research collaborations, and mentorship relationships that had grown out of my original scientific work. Many were now leaders in their own fields, continuing to expand and improve solutions for environmental challenges I'd never even considered when I was young. That felt like the ultimate measure of a life well lived, not just personal achievement, but the creation of systems and relationships that would continue generating positive impact long after any individual contributor was gone. Marcus had been wrong about everything that mattered. I hadn't failed to find someone better than him. I'd transcended the need for validation from anyone who couldn't understand the magnitude of what was possible when someone chose purpose over convention, curiosity over certainty, and humanity's future over personal comfort. And that, in the end, had made all the difference in ways that would continue rippling through human civilization for generations to come. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now, and hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.